Here's a hot tip for any who'd like to get into the high-spec field of blurting your opinion out once every few months on a platform drowning in opinions getting blurted out every day. Try not to blurt about something you really like. Or at least, if you do, make sure you're prepared for it to take a while. My Natsume's Book of Friends review, which to date is probably the video I'm happiest with, or at least is the surviving video I'm happiest with, took at least 5 near-total rewrites over 4 years to reach a point where I was satisfied with it. It took a long time for me to really get to grips with what exactly mattered most to me about something I loved so much, but I have to assume that means it's a worthwhile process to undergo, and not, a total waste of time. For example, since I realized that for Natsume, it was the series Meditations on Transience that really made the show so powerful to me, it's become a driving force behind the way I've analyzed several of the works I've talked about on this channel, and indeed in some cases beyond that. Outer Wilds, Mushishi, Breath of the Wild, that time I accidentally ran over a pheasant only to swerve too late and run over a second pheasant, all of which I've talked about at length, save perhaps that last one. The list goes on long enough to pad the word count of the script. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that for some bizarre reason, the more you care about something, the harder it seems to be to understand why. Now, since you're all assuredly reeling from what was definitely my greatest metaphor to date, and certainly not a justification for taking several months to make a 15-minute review whatsoever, we can finally get started talking about the show that everyone else also loved when it aired 17 years ago, So no Frieren, localized as Frieren Beyond Journey's End. It's definitely been my current stumbling block style labor of love, as evidenced by the fact this video's been in the works since before the series concluded, and since this whole bit's more or less shown my hand before I've even sat down at the table, which is a frustratingly common aspect of my reviews, instead of acting coy about it to build towards a satisfying conclusion, let's get it straight. Frieren, both the source material and the adaptation of it this review is covering, are something I very much enjoyed. Frieren is, in essence, a story about being an immortal in a largely mortal world, and in so doing presents possibly the only salient argument for why relative immortality is a bad thing, actually. Well, other than the fact that we live in hell, and it's a good thing we'll be getting off the ride before things really go south. Maybe I'm dwelling on mortality a bit too much. Speaking of hell though, in his play No Exit, Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote that hell is other people, and whilst I'd argue that hell is actually a rapidly decaying ecosphere, Frieren elaborates on that quirky old Frenchman's point by going one step further and yes-anding Sartre by saying, hell is other people's deaths, provided you care for them, as you remain the sole remaining witness to their existences, chronologically chained as you are in a purgatorial state of endless being, in a classic bit of improvisational comedy. They don't literally say this in the show, of course, because Frieren was written by a person with more than the slightest concept of restraint, and that idea of restraint is something we'll be coming back to later on. Frieren, the titular character that is, not the show itself, is the requisite elven mage of the classic Dragon Quest-style hero party that defeated the Demon King. And since we all know that song and dance by heart, instead the show picks up shortly after they've won, which doesn't happen that often. I mean, outside of the isekai genre, but the struggle to even remotely care about that narrative space is biblical. After the victory parade, Frieren skips a half-century farther than that to where everyone but our little elf is dying of old age and or alcohol poisoning, which is a much more alarming change of pace. Himmel, the hero of the party, passes away shortly thereafter, and at his funeral, Frieren realizes that she's now lost the opportunity to ever get to know someone she clearly cared about, even if she didn't know it at the time, and decides to go on a journey to try and understand humans who, unlike her, die in 80 years or so if they're relatively lucky. And if they aren't, they live a bit longer than that. She visits the priest of the party, little catch-up before he too is whisked away by the Reaper, who tricks her into acquiring a young student, Fern. And from then on, the plot is more or less a series of smaller arcs concerned with vignettes of our protagonists' lives, Frieren, Fern, and later the warrior Stark, as they retrace Himmel's steps to the castle where the Demon King was defeated on an adventure that is expected to take about 10 years, just as the first one did. It's rare, certainly in the works I've experienced, to see the lives of the immortal presented from the perspective of the immortal, those gaudy, hoity-toity, 1,000-years-old, holier-than-thou bastards. Usually we view it often enviously from the mortal side, unless we're watching that scene in The Two Towers where that elf guy gets the back of his head sliced open. Nasty way to go. Nonetheless, immortality is often depicted as a desirable thing, but I think what the show so aptly taps into to is immortality being directly and negatively contrasted with the concept of time. In the words of Brennan Lee Mulligan, fantasy is bad with time, which is a sentiment I find easy to agree with. The passage of time is often murky in fantasy, it's not usually dwelt on. Compare Final Fantasy XIV, where every major expansion pack has, according to the developers, transpired within the course of one single in-game year, effectively turning every narrative conflict into something that I suppose must have been resolved over a particularly eventful lunch break. Time in Frieren, however, is front and center. The amount of time passed is emblazoned on the screen with text at the beginning of each new story beat as a constant reminder of how long it's been since the death of Himmel. We can't forget how much time has passed. The show won't let us, like it's some kind of evil reverse therapist, and the show wants us to see that it is sad to be an observer of the passage of time, rather than an actor within it. From things as simple as spells requiring ingredients that come from species of monster that are now extinct, to the actions of friends turning into half-remembered myth or sometimes passing out of memory entirely, it's presented as inevitable, as it naturally is, the struggle against which is depicted as amongst the most heroic things Himmel ever did. Time is what defines us and our relationships to each other. It's one of the most fundamental principles of our existence. A being outside of time is a being with front row seats to the grand drama of humanity, but emotionally, Frieren has always been a spectator. The barrier between her and Himmel was their understanding of time. It was a mere 10-year adventure. It was an entire 10 years. The initial episode reads as a direct tragedy. There are moments of levity, but as a whole, the episode is a very sad thing to experience. Frieren confronts true loss, perhaps for the first time, both on the macro scale and the micro scale, and it's clearly established that she has no concept, or at least no empathy, for the experience of time. When Himmel dies, Frieren is shocked. She saw it coming, but she didn't think she'd feel it. Something I think a lot of people might not have expected, I certainly wouldn't have done were I not familiar with the source material, is the shift to a more comedic tone from the first episode out. It starts out as a tragedy, but turns into a comedy. I don't know if this is reading too much into it, or it's the intended effect, but it does feel like the light-hearted change in tone is a result of the light-hearted change in Frieren's point of view. The world was always brighter than it seemed to her, she just didn't notice it until after the wake-up call that was Himmel's death. She misses Himmel a lot. Her regret over not getting to know him before he passed is an omnipresent spectre, and her affection for him is obvious to everyone but her. But she's not an obsessed lover desperate to get her man back, not even close. She's taking the lessons she gained from that experience and is making sure she doesn't make that mistake twice. What I really like is that she's shown struggling with it too. It's not an easy thing to do, to change your perceptions. She upsets Fern frequently. She has to leave talking to her to Stark because she can't do it well enough. It's not a simple thing to become a different person. She did really love Himmel, though. We know that. Everyone else knows that. She's the only one who doesn't. It's not wisdom she's lacking, but emotional intelligence, and that, I suppose, is the inevitable affliction for someone who believes themselves to be so trapped outside the realm of the human experience. It's sort of an inversion of that old comedy is tragedy plus time idiom, where it instead becomes tragedy is comedy plus time. The show, despite the tragic nature of its initial thrust, is in most instances more of a comedy, but they always show their hand before the credits hit. If not that, they'll at least threateningly wave it around and whisper 3 aces into your ear at least, and end the episode on Frieren remembering Himmel or some other poignant depiction of how loss in time has affected the episode, or barring anything more direct, they leave us with the knowledge that these moments Frieren is spending with Fern and Stark are not going to last forever. It's a sentiment that's always there, but they're subtle about it. It is very much like Natsume's Book of Friends, a gentle show about a harsh truth rather than cruelly beating you over the head with it like it's the scene where the villain experiences the full fury of what happens when you blink once you're past the age of 20 in The Last Crusade. The core conceit of what happens to the immortal elf after the mortal party members die is a strong one to begin with, but the fact the dramatic question of the series is, will Frieren learn how to connect with humans, is a very significant sticking point, and, like some of the great emotional shows, it's something of a catch-22. If she doesn't, she'll never understand what Himmel really meant to her, and if she does understand, then Himmel's already dead and it's too late. Unless of course they get to Ende and the gang can meet the souls of the dead once again, of course, but I feel like most of us kind of understand that Himmel's not going to just come back. He's not the prize at the end of the quest like your typical damsel in distress type. He's, putting it kindly, not with us anymore. Putting it bluntly, with a sort of sleazy twist, he's worm food, baby, but I don't think anyone really expects this to be a story that ends happily. This really is, more than a lot of other series I can think of, a show where the journey is more important than the destination. After all, the story ended happily in the first few minutes of the first episode. It's been a while since the last time I saw a show break out into public consciousness like this. Frieren has become something of a touchstone, at least in the corners of the internet I reluctantly frequent, and there's been a not insignificant amount of posts about the show that is still going around. It's still going, in fact, he says, as though he's not doing the exact same thing. Clearly, for one reason or another, this is a show that a lot of people watched and a lot of people loved. Now, I enjoy taking gratification from seeing something get a successful adaptation as though I had any input whatsoever into its success, as much as the next person, naturally, but I think there's more to it than that. People seem to get Frieren. We're all engaging with it on more than just a surface level. It's a good story, well told, but it also has a very emotionally resonant undercurrent beneath that surface too, and a lot of us tapped into it. At the end of every episode, as we watched it live, a friend of mine and I would announce that it had been about as perfect an adaptation as either of us had ever seen. A big part of that adaptational success, I noted almost straight away, was in how restrained it was in its presentation. I knew the soundtrack was scored predominantly by one Evan Call, the same fellow responsible for Violet Evergarden's sweeping, stirring, emotionally resonant orchestrations, and upon hearing the music that played alongside the second trailer for the series, I was prepared for another beautiful soundtrack that perfectly rode the emotional highs. But the biggest tell about how considered the soundtrack was is the way that it rides not just the highs, but the lows and the natural in-betweens as well. Nearly every song on Evergarden's soundtrack is very intense and emotionally rich, but Frieren's score is much more muted, and oftentimes during an episode the only sounds we hear are entirely diegetic. And the score is, of course, still emotionally rich and sweeping when it needs to be, as I'm sure you'll agree if you've been enjoying the music I've been playing throughout this review, except for that short beat where I played a few minutes of Que Sera Sera. Cole said it himself on his Twitter. He intended the soundtrack to serve almost as a narrator for the series rather than just act as something to augment the experience. It's its own character, and it's probably the thing that impressed me the most about this already hugely impressive adaptation. The animation captures this sentiment as well. The series is slow, reserved, and calm, providing a wonderful pace for some character interaction, but in addition to that, it also provides juxtaposition for some of the most slickly, impressively animated fight sequences I've ever seen. They hit ever harder, nestled in between the calmer moments as they are, like a hand grenade sitting in between a bunch of Sanrio character plushies, but even then, the animators use restraint to their advantage. Some might ask, why use 100 frames when 10 would do, but the team behind Frieren instead went with the more bombastic, why use 10 when you could use 0, resulting in the single coolest swing of a weapon I've ever f***ing seen, made ever cooler by the fact that the characters had been calmly talking for 3 entire minutes beforehand. The fact the only sounds that play are the sounds of the voice acting and the soundtrack itself really... See, but her axe does make a sound as it moves through the air, which just highlights how well considered not just the soundtrack, but the entire soundscape is. Stark swings faster and harder to the point where not even the air makes a sound as he cuts through it. They convey two characters' relative mastery and strength through not just breathtakingly restrained use of visual language, but through clever use of audio as well. That's a small example, but I think it does illustrate just how much thought seems to have been put into every aspect of this adaptation. Now, I will say, I don't know how controversial this opinion is, but I feel the show flags somewhat in the second half of this first season. I actually stopped reading the manga when it got to around this part, hoping that when I picked it up again it had finished, which isn't necessarily a glowing review. I just don't think that Magical Wizard School Test Arc plays to the series' strengths as well as the more episodic format does. Perhaps that would have gotten tired after a while, but I think the series' greatest strength is in a short format, a series of relatively rapid hellos and goodbyes. Kraft here may have been on screen for half of one episode, but he sticks with me a lot more than someone like Land does, presumably named because he's about as interesting as a barren tract of it. And that's not to say I disliked that arc, of course. All the qualities that made this adaptation great are still in full swing there, but it doesn't lend itself to that core theme of the passage of time so appropriately. Nor do we get to see the hugely entertaining interplay between Fern and Stark, since Stark spends most of the second half of this season staying up past his bedtime and drinking heavily, just like I do when I'm home alone. But we can't end an episode on a poignant note about how Himmel the hero would have pirated Photoshop if nothing in the episode made Frieren remember him. Kids these days. She ought to have said that. Perhaps the greatest benefit of being immortal is that one doesn't need to worry about whatever the skibbity toilet means. Christ, I need to wash my mouth out with soap or something after that. I don't know what the that means. You know, on that note, perhaps the reason for its popularity is how it just appealed to my demographic so specifically. We're entering the period of our lives where there's a fully fledged younger generation now. Age is starting to kick in a major way. Time feels like it's moving even faster. I keep seeing those Frieren blinks and half the years past images still floating around, so I imagine that definitely plays a part. We're basically just like her, complete with a near total inability to comprehend anything at all. If I hadn't made it completely obvious here, I think this series is a proper triumph of a thing. On top of its narrative being a hugely poignant conversation about the importance of memory and the value of human connection, it's also just superlatively put together. It's extremely well paced, animated, scored, voice acted. It's one of the most engaging series I've seen in a rather long time, as evidenced by its cultural footprint. That much is very easy to say, of course. After all, as Frieren so vicariously shows us, for some bizarre reason, the more you care about something, the harder it seems to be to understand why.